On today's episode of Garage Noise, we're going to talk about prepping out and painting a used part for your vehicle. We're going to walk you through the steps it takes to prep it out, paint it, so you have a seamless repair on your vehicle. So let's dig in and let's get started. So the first thing we need to do is we need to look over the part that you get, and it really starts at the purchase. When you're looking over a part, you want to look for any dents, dings, or scratches that are in the paint. This one seems to be pretty good. It's got some light scratches and scuffs you can see here, but overall the paint is in very good condition. It's not delaminated or faded or sun damaged. The condition of it's in pretty good, and it doesn't have any dents. There are some scuffs. There's a little paint scuff there. If you look here, there's a little stone chip here. And then we come around here and there's a little bit of a chip here in the paint and possibly a little. Now, it's not too bad. That's something that can be corrected, and I'm going to show you exactly how to correct these things before you paint it on your vehicle. This fender is black, as you can see, and the truck that we're repairing is white. Okay, so now that we've evaluated this, checked out any damage that we might need to repair, we're going to strip it down by removing the emblems or any moldings. So on this particular fender, the paint is in good condition. So what we're going to do is we're going to sand this paint with 320 grit sandpaper, smooth it out, and that will get it prepped out for primer or sealer. Now, the part that you purchase may not be in such good condition. You may have delaminated paint, sun-faded paint, or peeling paint. If you have a roughness to your part, and you need to smooth it out, you can use 320. Now, it may just take a little bit longer, but you may want to step down to 180 grit sandpaper to help smooth it out just a little bit quicker, and then you could go over it with 320 grit. Now, I'm going to be using an orbital sander to sand this fender with the 320 grit sandpaper. You don't have to have an orbital sander. You can do this by hand. You can take a piece of 320, put it on a foam pad or a block. 320 grit on a block or a foam pad like this, or even wrapped around a 1500 grit scuff pad. That's what this is. And then you could sand this all by hand. If you're going to prime your fender, so if you have some scratches, if it's a drastic color change, I would recommend you primer it before you paint it. If you're going to prime it, you need to use at least 400 or 320 grit sandpaper to prep it out for the primer. Now, this paint is in almost good enough condition, and it just depends what kind of finished product you want, where you could wet sand this with 600 grit or 400 grit sandpaper and then put color right over top of it. So you have to make that decision. I'll leave that up to you, but I want to give you all the information that you need to get this done. So let's sand this with 320, and then we'll talk about the chips and scratches and how we're going to repair those. Okay, so we got most of this fender sanded with 320 grit. Now, when it came down to this chip, I'm going to show you right here what I did, but I feather edged this chip out. There's a little stone chip right here on this edge of this fender. So what I did is I used my DA and I just gradually feathered it out so it's a smooth transition into the old paint. You can do that by hand. It takes a little bit longer. You got a stone chip in the center here. You don't really want to feather edge a small stone chip out like that because it's going to create a low spot in your paint. It's better to fill those areas with a little bit of spot putty filler, and I'll show you how to do that over here on the rest of the fender. So I'm going to show you how we feather edge it out right here on this damage. So I got my sander here with the 320 grit on it. We're just going to sand out this hard edge and feather it out. Okay, so now that's all feathered out. It's got a smooth edge here. It feels like there's a little bit of a dent right there, so we're gonna have to add a little spot putty filler to flatten that out. So when you're prepping out your part, you wanna make sure you get all those areas that are hard to reach and hard to get with the DA. Sand those by hand. I'm using a 600 to 800 grit Scotch-Brite here, and we're getting all that sanded out so the primer or sealer adheres properly. Okay, so now that we got this all sanded with the 320 grit sandpaper, all the edges, all the areas on this fender, we're gonna blow it off, and then I'm gonna wash it with some wax and grease remover. Now, if you're doing this at home, you can use anything to wash it with. You can use soap and water or rubbing alcohol. Those will work perfectly. And then we're gonna look for the chips, and I'm gonna show you how to fill those chips. Okay, we'll just spray it down with some wax and grease remover. The preparation is the most important part, so make sure you got it all sanded and prepped out properly. Okay, all clean. Okay, so we have a couple little nicks. If I can show you right there. There's a little chip. We're gonna fill those with some spot putty. Right there's a little chip. Right there. And then there's a little ding here where we're gonna fill, and I'm gonna show you how we do that. I'm just gonna use a little spot putty repair on that. But first of all, I think I'm gonna put some primer on this bare metal here. Okay, I just have a little bit of self-etching primer in a can here. This is just good for small areas where you break through down to bare metal, because you really wanna use a self-etching primer to cover bare metal, or some kind of primer that's designed to go over bare metal. So I'm just gonna put a light coat, a small coat on this. And then there's another spot right here we're gonna get. And then I'll let that dry, and then we'll fill it with some spot putty. Okay, this is the spot putty here we'll be using. It's the R1 Spot 1000 made by Roberlo. And I'll leave links in the descriptions to these products and tools that I use. This is just gonna air dry. We're not going to have to use any hardener or catalyst in it. So I just get a little bit off here. There's a little chip right there. We're just going to fill it. Doesn't take much. I'm putting a little extra on there because we're going to block it off. This is dry now, so we're just gonna lay a little bit of spot putty in here. Okay, we'll let this dry, block it, and I'll show you how we prime this. Okay, now that spot putty is dry, I've got a couple different blocks here. I'm gonna use this foam block to block this out. And really you can do this by hand with anything you have. Just, you wanna block it, hold it flat, and block it straight. This one I'm going to have to leave a little bit more of the spot putty in there because it's a little bit of a dent. So, and I don't want to feel any edges. And there it is, it's smooth. Now I'm going to apply a little bit more etch primer on it because it's got some bare metal showing. Okay, so I'm going to just spray a little bit more of the self-etching primer on this area here. That covered, and then I'm going to use just some filler primer. This is it's
high build sandable primer, but it's a lacquer primer. There's no catalyst in it, just to cover up these little chip areas. And then we'll just lightly scuff those before we apply the paint. Okay, this primer's dry now. We're just gonna simply scuff it with a little bit of 320 just to smooth it out. Okay, now I'm just gonna wash this with wax and grease remover one more time. We'll tack rag it and then we'll apply a little bit of sealer on it.
Okay, so now that we have it cleaned with prep solvent, we're gonna go over it with just a tack rag, remove any lint or dust that may have accumulated on the panel, make sure it's clean just before we spray the sealer. I've opted to go with sealer here rather than primer. It doesn't really call for primer. Everything is pretty much prepped out for a good finished product. So good sealer is gonna just create a good substrate between the old paint and the new paint. So I'm using very low pressure on my gun here. I'm using the Segola 3300 GTO and probably just about 20 PSI, and I've got the volume turned down. I typically like to put sealer on the first coat light. It can react sometimes depending on the circumstances if you put it on too heavy. This is probably just a medium coat to a little wet, and everything was okay. So if you're applying primer, it's a little bit different. Your primer, you could put it on a little bit heavier if you have some areas you need to block out or cover so you can sand some rough areas out. So we want this sealer to be smooth and clean because we're applying the paint right over the sealer. We're not sanding in between coats. Now, if you were using primer because you had some areas and imperfections you wanted to take care of before you applied paint, then you will need to sand that primer smooth before you apply the paint. Okay, so now we're going to apply the first coat of white base. I'm setting my gun up at about 24 PSI. I have it about 2.5 turns out on the volume. Of course, you can adjust that accordingly, however you need, but I don't want to produce a lot of overspray here, and it's not necessarily to have a lot of air pressure when I'm applying this base. So you want to do even passes. You want to be consistent on the distance from the panel. It's just good practice. It's not that concerning on a base white, but it's just good to be in the habit of doing nice uniform passes at the right distance. You also want to overlap 70% on base and clear coat. Another thing to remember when you're painting your part is you want to make sure all of your edges are covered really well. Those are the areas that are going to get missed if you miss anything. So I go around those typically first to make sure there's a good coat of paint on those, and then I will do them again in between coats. So now I'm going to go ahead and apply the second coat of base. One thing we didn't mention is if you don't have an aerosol, or if you don't have a spray gun or a compressor, you could spray this with an aerosol can. Duplicolor makes aerosol can, and they'll mix up your paint code in that can so you can paint your fender, and then you could use a good 2K aerosol clear coat to spray it with. Now maybe I will tackle that in another video, but for these purposes we're going to use a compressor and a spray gun. The other thing to mention is if you want a perfect paint job, you are going to have to do a blending procedure and blend into the adjacent panels. And if you want to check out how to blend, I will leave a link to a video at the end, and you can check out that video, and that'll tell you what you need to know on blending your color. Okay, so we're ready to put our first coat of clear on. I am going to be using the Roberlo R1 clear coat and catalyst. We'll mix it up and get ready to spray our clear. The procedure for spraying clear is pretty much the same. You want to overlap 70%. You want to do consistent passes, consistent speed, consistent distance from the panel. Now I did bump up my pressure just a little bit. That helps the clear coat atomize just a little bit better, and it'll give you a smoother, flatter finish. I'll run this at about 27 psi on the air pressure, and then the volume I will turn up to about 3 turns out on the volume. Now that is all subject to the conditions you're painting in, the temperature, and how you spray. The speed you move, all those things have a factor on what your settings should be. So just evaluate the clear as you're laying it down and see how the finish is coming out and make adjustments from there. If your clear is coming out a little bit rough, you probably need a little bit more air pressure and a little less material coming out of the gun. So you would dial that volume down just a little bit and bump up the air pressure. If it's coming out dry, you want a little bit more volume coming out and probably a little less air pressure. If you click on this video now, you'll see exactly how to blend your paint for a perfect color match. So here's a good look at the finished product. It has a nice shine, nice gloss, and you can do this at home. If you enjoy this content, do me a favor, like, subscribe, and click the bell so you don't miss anything. I appreciate each and every one of you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.